Okay, I've just been given the go-ahead to restart. So for those of you who have just joined us, good morning and a very warm welcome to this webinar on nature recovery networks in partnership with Natural England. I'm Judy Cale-Hammond. I am the Director of Policy and Advice at the CLA, and it is my pleasure to be chairing the webinar this morning. In a few moments, I will introduce our speakers, but before I do, for those people who have just joined us, a few points of logistics. So, first of all, if you are not yet familiar with Zoom questions and answers functions, you will see from the slide here that there is a Q&A button. Please press that at any point during the session if you would like to ask a question. We will take as many questions as we can after the three presentations, and you may of course ask questions from any individual speakers or from the whole panel. And I should remind you that today's session is being recorded for delegates to watch on demand. So with webinar mechanics out of the way, let's turn to the topic at hand. The Nature Recovery Network was announced in the government's 25-year environment plan in 2018, and it will be central to the forthcoming nature strategy. The CLA is supportive of the idea as a mechanism to align government policy and funding towards a long-term strategic goal. The challenge, as often, is for Nature Recovery Network to actually result in more clarity and coherence for land managers on the ground rather than add complexity. We hope that the Nature Recovery Network will allow better recognition of all that CLA members are already doing for nature recovery, much of which at the moment goes unnoticed. It is a chance to celebrate the role of land management and celebrate what private landowners are delivering and can deliver in the future. Today's webinar is a very timely opportunity to hear from government what nature recovery networks are, how they're intended to work, and how they will fit within what is still a complex policy framework for nature and land use. So let me introduce our speakers. So our first speaker this morning will be Julian Harlow, who is the head of local delivery at DEFRA. Julian has been in the department for just under 10 years, previously working on the government's 25-year environment plan, and before that, the Nature Capital Committee. Prior to that, he was Natural England's chief economist. We will then hear from Aidan Lonergan, who is the strategic lead for Natural England on the Nature Recovery Network. Aidan has previously worked as Natural England area manager for West Anglia, and before that he worked for 16 years at the RSPB. He was their director in Northern Ireland and more recently established their landscape scale conservation programme. The third speaker this morning will be James Grisham, who is the Principal Advisor for Nature Recovery Network delivery in Natural England. He has specific responsibility for the local delivery of Nature Recovery Network. It is really nice to see in his biography that he says that it is through local area staff and the relationships with people like CLA members that the real work happens. James, you've already netted yourself a lot of brownie points with the audience. Much of James's professional life has been spent in the delivery of farm advice through catchment sensitive farming and agri-environment in England, and before that in Australia. And I like somebody who says in their biography that they bore their children about soils. So I think another load of brownie points. So without further ado, I will hand over to Julian for an overview of the local nature recovery strategies, which will inform the Nature Recovery Network. So Julian, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me, much appreciated. So as Judy Guff says, yeah, I'm Julian Harlow. I'm head of local delivery in DEFRA. I'm also the deputy head of the land use policy team. And one of the policy areas I look after is local nature recovery strategies. I've got a few slides. I'll go through those very quickly. And there are basically 4 questions that I'm going to try and answer that will hopefully give you a flavour of what the policy is and how we intend to implement it. I'll describe roughly what local nature recovery strategies are, why they're needed, how we think we're going to use them or what their intended uses are, and then importantly, most importantly, how you can hopefully get involved should you wish to. So moving on, thank you. So what are local nature recovery strategies? In a nutshell, they are a new system of spatial strategies for nature recovery, and they're one of a series of new measures in the Environment Bill. Very simply, each strategy, and this is set out in the bill, will do 3 things. Firstly, it will agree priorities for nature recovery in the area. It will map the most valuable existing areas for nature, so things like national conservation sites and designations. And this is a critical bit. It will hopefully map proposals for creating or improving habitat for nature and wider environmental benefits. And as I'll come on to, this is the key bit around nature recovery objectives. So if each strategy does those 3 things, hopefully we will get national coverage of LNRSs through around 50 of them covering the whole of England. It's important to emphasise this applies to England. The Environment Bill mostly applies to England. So we envisage that each local nature recovery strategy will be locally led, for example, by county councils or possibly combined authorities, to be confirmed. It will be evidence-based, or they will be evidence-based, and they will be collaboratively produced involving public bodies and in particular key stakeholders. Hopefully that gives you a flavour of what they are. Next slide, please. Why do we need them? Well, hopefully there is decent evidence now, and people appreciate there is decent evidence that nature is in decline, not only nationally, but globally. I think in this country, it's particularly prevalent around declines in species-rich grasslands, pollinators, and farm and bird indicators as examples. A seminal report in 2010 really focused on the need for recovery and reversing declines. And it pointed out really that a lot of our nature now is in isolated sites. These are quite fragmented, and that we need more connectivity across the landscapes. I think in response to that, in recent years, as Judy Gell said, government has committed to ambitious nature recovery objectives. These are set out in the 25-year plan, in particular, the Nature Recovery Network, and much more recently, as part of passage of the Environment Bill, government has committed to set a 2030 species abundance target. So lots of ambition there. I think that ambition will grow as we go into next year and we prepare for the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Next slide, please. So context, how will local nature recovery strategies be used? I think this is the key bit. We see the strategies as really being the focal point for a broad range of different funding and delivery activities. I think we're only going to hit our nature recovery objectives and meet wider environmental ambitions if we bring different delivery levers, funding sources together as effectively as possible around a shared set of priorities and objectives. That's fundamentally what local nature recovery strategies are trying to do. They will provide the underpinning framework for the Nature Recovery Network, and they'll do that by identifying the places which, once we've taken action on the ground, that'll enable the network to grow over time. Specifically around delivery levers and funding sources, we're currently looking at how LNRSs could be used to incentivise things like biodiversity net gain, which is another measure in the Environment Bill that applies to planning gain. More broadly, what role LNRSs will have in the planning system, and we're talking to our colleagues across government both about existing systems but also planning reforms. How will LNRSs be used by other public authorities when discharging their biodiversity duties? And again, that's something that we will be strengthening by the Environment Bill. Public authorities will have to have regard to local nature recovery strategies when delivering their biodiversity duties. We also see a big role for local nature recovery strategies in helping to target funding for nature-based solutions, tree planting, peatland restoration, natural flood management. These can all make a contribution to our nature recovery objectives. And finally, and importantly, we see LNRS as having a role in helping to identify locations or possibly activities that could be funded through the new environmental land management schemes. If we bring all those things together around a common set of priorities, areas and objectives that we develop through a collaborative process, local nature recovery strategies, then I think we stand a good chance of being able to deliver on some of our ambitions and commitments. Next slide, please. Thank you. Finally, how can you engage in local nature recovery strategies? We've recently completed 5 pilots. These were in Cornwall, Buckinghamshire, Greater Manchester, Cumbria and Northumberland. We've already published our lessons learned. The reason I'm saying this is that hopefully some of you will have already been involved to some extent in some of these pilots or have had some exposure. We've learned a massive amount from these pilots, but we also want to hear more views. We currently have a consultation open, asking a lot of different questions about how we should approach preparing local nature recovery strategies and what they should contain. That's out on Citizen Space. We have specific questions in there around collaboration, so how we work with stakeholders and how we might ensure farmers, land managers, landowners are able to get involved in the preparation and delivery of local nature recovery strategies. I mean, one of the key lessons I think from the pilots is that there could be a lot of different strategies across the country. How might nationally based organisations or even very local ones feed into that broader picture? We tested something called a local convener alongside the pilots, and that was basically an additional resource. It was housed in Natural England, and what that tried to do in particular was reach out to the land owning and land management sector to ensure that they could plug into local nature recovery strategies and make sure that your views, expertise fed in. And I think that's it. I just take a moment to implore you almost to please have a look at the consultation. We're really keen to hear your views. There's a while yet before it closes. I think it's November the 2nd, but there are quite a few questions in there. Excuse me. So do take your time, have a think. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Julian, for this presentation. And before I give the floor to Aidan, just to let participants know that the CLA will, of course, be responding to the DEFRA consultation on local nature recovery strategies. And if you would like to be involved in the shaping of that response, please get in touch with us. The name and contact details for the relevant colleague will be appearing in the chat bar. Thank you very much. Thank you, Julian. Aidan, over to you.
Ready to go. Thank you, Judica. Good morning, everybody, wherever you are across the country. My name is Aidan Lonergan. I'm lead advisor or principal advisor on the Nature Recovery Network for Natural England. I hope the weather is as good wherever you are. I'm based in Cambridge in an office and the weather looks sunny. So if it applies to you, I hope you've got the harvest in or the plan is afoot to get it in. I've been in this role about 5 months and I've been asked to talk to you today about our ambition and objectives for the Nature Recovery Network. Next slide, please. So in the next 7 minutes, I'll cover why the NRN, picking up on some of the themes that Julian has previously discussed in his excellent presentation on the local nature recovery strategies. Talk a little bit about the NRN objectives, more particularly after 5 months in the role. I'll share with you what I think are some of the challenges for landowners, CLA members, etc. A bit like Julian said, I'll talk about what I see would be the role of CLA members in the NRN going forward. And obviously after James's presentation, we'll be here for the Q&A where you can pick up any of the aspects of the piece I'm going to do now. So if you read the blurb online, or if you look at the 25-year plan, the Nature Recovery Network is described as a national network of wildlife-rich places, which we will expand and improve and connect across the towns and cities and countryside, okay? It won't tell you that this is a fantastically ambitious government policy, and we've never done this before. In fact, no developed country has ever done this before, so it's a huge undertaking. And it is a major part of the 25-year plan ambition for this government. You can see the illustration on the slide in front of you. That's taken from the Lawton report of 2010. It's a kind of a schematic representation about just connecting up with stepping stones, protected area of land across a farmed and managed landscape. You're probably well familiar with this, but it's building on what we have and creating that network of functioning sites across the country by connecting them up with stepping stones and corridors. Next slide, please, moving on. But I want you to think also about the nature recovery network in the widest sense. It's not just about biodiversity and habitats. And you can see here that government policy now is establishing the NRN will do the following. Yes, it does start with existing wildlife sites, places, habitats, those sort of things, but it will also improve the landscape's resilience to climate change. We're all aware of what's happening with the climate. It's now gone way past that there's any debate upon it. You only have to look at what's going on around the world. Land management is a key tool in terms of the adaptation and mitigation policies of this country. Flood and carbon defense, again, land has a huge role to play in that. So again, another objective of the NRN. Or natural and cultural diversity. 70% of the country is farmed. Lots of the species and habitats there because it is a farm landscape. It's got a whole range of assets that we need to protect as we're doing all these other stuff. So it's a combined approach to the nature recovery network I want to underline here. And then as we know, and this is a bit where we always have to manage a bit, enable everyone to enjoy and connect with nature where they live. It's not about loads of people trampling over land. It's about having a network of places near to where people live, and also having those places that are providing the ecosystem services, the climate change adaptation, the species recovery, etc. It is this national network we want. Moving on. As I said at the start, this hasn't been done before, and it is a huge challenge, and it is quite daunting. And there are so many moving parts to it in terms of policy, in terms of who's doing what, in terms of roles and responsibilities, moving from the international down to the national, into the local, through the local nature recovery strategies that Julian spoke about. And nationally, what's happening at the moment is DEFRA and NE in government are bringing together the policy and legislation, as Julian said, the spatial tools through the LNRSs to promote and develop the NRN locally. We're developing, and you'll see one of the themes coming out of there, the need for a strong partnership. You know, any DEFRA can't do this themselves. This is about a whole range of partners coming together, including the vital role of land managers like yourselves, and bringing those together into a conversation about how do we collectively deliver and incentivize delivery of all these multifaceted objectives in places across the country, so we get all these benefits that I've described in the previous slide. And then the last thing, which is, I know this has been an issue for CLA members, but bringing the whole thing together into a really coherent process and narrative that's fairly straightforward to understand, so people can engage with this vision rather than going, I understand bits of it, but I'm not sure how it all adds up together. And key to this, obviously, is incentivizing it and funding it. And it was mentioned earlier, biodiversity net gain is coming down the track when the Environment Bill becomes law. But we also have the new schemes, which I'm sure you're well familiar with, which are centered around the premise of incentivizing involvement in nature's recovery, which is a big shift, as we know from the previous schemes. But again, not forgetting that we still have lots of earlier schemes still in operation. I think up to 30,000 across the country still in operation. So we don't want to lose out the benefits of those either. Moving on. So what's different? Well, I noticed my biog photograph that I sent through, or somebody took from LinkedIn, was a few years ago. So I'm probably looking grayer now and more like my dad, but it feels different for somebody like me who's worked in the sector for over 25 years. There is a sustained commitment and engagement across government. The biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, the public money for public goods debate, they're all high on the agenda, and you can see the policy outworkings of all of those things. Providing the funding for this and making it easy to access it and straightforward to access it is a vital component of this. And there's a lot of work being done on that in terms of the formulation and design of the new schemes. It's part of the 25-year plan ambition. This is a long-term project to recover nature, the services it provides, and all the things I described earlier about the objectives of the NRN. So we're not going to do this in 3 years. It's going to be a long-term goal. There's going to be lots of milestones on the way. I won't say we're coming out of the pandemic. We still seem to have one foot in it and one foot out of it. But we know from that the importance of access to green space, the importance of nature, the environment, fresh air, etc. for people has never been as strongly understood as through our experiences over the last 18 months, 2 years. And obviously we've got to think of this isn't, you know, we need to build on the lessons of what we've done previously with Biodiversity 2020, etc. We need to involve a whole range of partners, not only the people who manage land, but the people who have an interest in managed land, the NGOs, we had a session with them last week, but also new partners who, you know, look after things like community engagement, people engagement, those kind of things. So we're getting access to these areas, but also businesses. We know from things like the Dasgupta report that, you know, the role that businesses will play in the recovery of nature and its services is going to be hugely important, either directly through their supply chain or through funding it through CSR, but also just, you know, genuinely seeing the need to invest in a high quality environment where the staff work and live. And as I said, this isn't compulsory. These are the schemes which will underpin it. The 3 new schemes will as ever be voluntary and competitive. So this is an incentive. And I do think sessions like this, where we really open up the conversation with members of the CLA and find out what you need to know to really engage with this and understand it more, is a really important part of the dialogue. Communications on this is incredibly important. Moving on. And these are just some examples. I mentioned earlier the moving parts, and it is complicated. It's complicated for somebody like me who works in this for a living and spend my time trying to understand these moving parts. There's a huge amount of them. And I think one of the challenges for DEFRA and NE is to translate all these moving parts into, as I said, here's the story, this is what it means, this is how you engage with it, rather than you've got to figure so much of this stuff out yourself. We want an end of, you know, the end of these processes having an interface which is very clear about how you would get involved, why you would get involved, what are the incentives associated with getting involved, etc., etc. But there's a huge amount of stuff going on in the background, and more to come with the green paper in preparation at the moment. Next slide. I mentioned partnership, and this can't be stated strongly enough. So we have the NRN Landscape National Partnership, which has been going since last November, and we already have 450 members there. That's a vital conduit for sharing information on policy developments, having conversations about challenges and issues that members might have, or picking up specific topics that we want to do, you know, more briefings on and have conversations on. And then there's the local partnerships which underpin the LNRS work, which was described earlier. And it's really important that, you know, the CLA get involved at both levels, both the national and the local partnership. And NE, which you'll hear from James in a minute, has been gearing up its local capacity to engage with both LNRSs, but generally the partnership conversations locally. Next slide. Okay, I've mentioned the integration of the NRN objectives into funding. I'm not going to go through these in details, but you know that the new schemes are designed around nature's recovery. You'll understand all that. There's a whole range of other funding available, which I think James will talk about also. And we are investing capacity and thinking into how we bring more private sector funding into this endeavour. Moving on. Okay, so it's a huge opportunity. It's also a huge challenge. I said we haven't done this before, and it is quite difficult. There's huge efforts being put into around policy alignment to make sure everything joins up, so it's pointing in the right direction and it's integrated. Everybody has a part to play, land managers and a whole range of other organisations. For CLA members, it's important to note it is incentive driven. It will be a collective endeavour. The biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis requires a societal response, there's no doubt about that. And integration locally is the key. Just getting a layering of public policy working in a place would be great. We've got to keep the bureaucracy to a minimum and the information flows going back and forward all the time. We need the right level of governance. Obviously, we're working on monitoring and evaluation in the background with DEFRA for the network. And it's more about sustained delivery and not process. So we want to learn the lessons from previous initiatives. But I'll finish for there now. Thank you, Jigsaw.
Thank you very much, Aidan, and I'm going to hand over to James. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and it's a privilege for me to be here today and talk to so many people who have been involved for so long in nature recovery. And I guess you see my bio up there. You know, I am involved in nature recovery. James Griffith. I'm Australian, so if you pick a little bit of twang up in the accent, that's what's going on there. But I guess the other thing I wanted to say, it's a privilege to be here with you from the CLA, but it's also a privilege for me to lead a bunch of people locally who are trying to engage with people like yourselves and with local authorities and different partners to really think about how to deliver this stuff locally. So I guess my intent is to go through a few slides now and just talk about some, you know, almost speculate as to how this stuff could be delivered locally. We've heard from Julian about what the plan will be. So we've got some plans potentially in the next couple of years to say what we want to deliver in these particular places. We've got the policy that's been expressed very, very, very well by Aidan to kind of, you know, identify the range of opportunities that might be in a place and what's going to, you know, how that will deliver against different requirements internationally, nationally, and locally. And now I'm just going to talk about how that might work in a particular place. So I am now controlling the screen. Letty, I'm trying to control the screen and it's not happening. Okay, Letty, if you can just go to the next screen, please. Okay, so so that's the title. Next one. So going back to this thing, a picture that Aidan showed you before. So, you know, really what this is trying to say is this is following this Lawton approach that Aidan mentioned, but this is about understanding what we're trying to do across this network. It's a recognition of the stuff that yourselves as members of the CLA have already done for nature, but also appreciating that with all of that stuff that you've done for nature, we're still in a situation where we've got, you know, wildlife declining in different ways, whether, you know, different bird indexes or species or whatever we want to do. So I guess the evidence suggests that all of this work that we're doing about fantastic habitats and all this work you're doing about sustainable farming and that sort of thing, it only makes a difference, or it makes a much bigger difference for nature if it's joined up across a network. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to optimize all that fantastic work that yourselves have done over the years for nature through agri-environment or off your own backs actually for nature. So that's what this is. It's about understanding the core sites where existing nature is managed better with, you know, how we can brigade resources to support you and advice and all that sort of thing. We want to be able to protect those sites from external pressures, you know, whether that's things like pollution or, you know, from the air or water or you know, or other things, sometimes recreational pressure, adaptable to climate change, species recovering across the landscape, recognizing that those species be in those habitats as well as outside, understanding that this needs to sit within the economy. It needs to sit within the economy, but so that nature is sustained and grown within an economical system. So it needs to pay its own way, but it also needs to be part of a financial framework, connecting properly with communities. I think if we don't connect properly with communities, will people care? Will taxpayers still, you know, fund this sort of activity if they don't care about this nature we're trying to deliver for society? And then the whole idea about the network being expanded through innovative finance, which Aidan mentioned. Next slide, please. So it is a complex landscape. It is. There's loads of different opportunities, I think, out there for, you know, to deliver this stuff. But I think what I'm trying to show with this slide is, you know, we can try and arrange it in terms of the themes we're trying to deliver for this place. And I guess it's the recognition that we want to connect people with nature and your activities that you're doing. So, you know, you can get that recognition that Judical, you know, mentioned before. So there's this opportunity to gain support from society, things like green social prescribing, national coastal trails, educational access, children and nature. There's this opportunity still to develop the core with all these funding opportunities. The thing about protecting from externalities that I mentioned before, there are opportunities through things like catchment-based approach, water company investments, catchment-sensitive farming, ammonia deposition reduction, and on farmland. You know, we still have countryside stewardship. Yes, the environmental land management schemes are coming, but, you know, we still have, you know, a couple of years to deliver countryside stewardship and a recognition of all the things you've already done here. We've got nature-based land management, you know, outside of the schemes, and we have potentially these, as I say, these new schemes. We have species recovery going on that, you know, the recognition that yes, within habitats, there's all sorts of things things we can do for species. But outside that, all these things that I've seen farmers do for barn owls in their barns, and margins and different farm wildlife that may not necessarily have an association with particular habitats. It's been extraordinary. And also don't forget about the invasives work that you've all done so much about, whether that be about disease or species. Regulation and planning, we've got opportunities for biodiversity net gain, green infrastructure plans, strategic species license, national infrastructure strategies. Now, what this means is that there's opportunities perhaps with your land or with your clients to think about how you can support a strategic species license or whatever with compensatory habitats perhaps on your land. But again, if that works for you. And then in other innovative finance and policy strategy synergies like contribution to climate change, peat and woodland schemes, natural flood management and water resources. Now, I've made this complicated now. I'm appreciating that. So they're the range of different opportunities, and I think there's lots more. So next slide, please. So we've got different approaches in different parts of the landscape. And this is why I hope I'm starting to simplify this down. So we've got an area of, so that's Cambridge in the center there. And we've got 3 areas surrounding Cambridge, which altogether we want to form into one network. In the top right-hand corner, we've got we've got Wickham Fen, which is a big landscape, which is the idea of, very wet, very, iconic landscape, which is, doing all sorts of things. And what we want to do up there is have big agricultural reform, potentially to make big habitats, to be big blocks, to do all sorts of exciting things for things like, bitterns, reed warblers and all that sort of thing. And that's what we can do in that space. We've already started, and that's fantastic. But so there's specific things we could do with peat, etc. in that particular space. And if we can click on the bottom right-hand corner, we've got a very different landscape. This is much smaller, fragmented bits of habitat where we might want to engage with, say, mid-tier of countryside stewardship, or we, in that case, could be biodiversity net gain. There could be small bits of net gain habitat because of the load of development that's going on around Cambridge. And similarly, in that position, we're probably going to work with particular businesses like the golf course there, where we want bits of habitat to be able to provide this stepping stone opportunity. So 2 different opportunities there. And now the third one to the left, this is the woodland thing. So this is much more about woods. It's about bigger, better, more joined up woods, and engaging with, say, the tree strategy or different ways of managing woodland. So already we're starting to simplify, but all this is brought together with the last place in Cambridge, in the middle of there, with a green infrastructure strategy. So joining this up and thinking about how access could work. So are there more sensitive places where people shouldn't be, where people could be, and all that sort of thing. Again, simplifying with different bits of the landscape, all happening as one unit. Next slide, please. So this is the jigsaw, how it could work in, say, for example, Purbeck. And so there's some opportunities here for, using site of alternate natural green space. And just keep clicking through these, please, Letty. So we've got agri-environment schemes down here. We've got another one coming up over there, Letty, which is about, actually considering a Dorset Wildlife Trust reserve extension. Further up to the right, nuclear reactor decommissioning, heathland restoration. We've got Dorset Green Industrial Units, and keep it going on, Letty. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a load of different opportunities in this particular place, but actually what we're trying to do is deliver one coherent nature recovery network as a block here. So there's different things you've been able to deliver here, but what you've recognized is that there's a bunch of habitats that we want to create, and we can pick and choose as to the sort of investment regimes which might give us the best bang for our habitat buck. So that's, and if we can go on to the next slide, please, Letty. So this is my final slide, you might be delighted to know. So developing opportunities, and what I haven't really gone on about particularly are the new schemes. We will see what comes out of the environmental land management system, but it looks as though there's all sorts of interesting opportunities, whether to pilot it or generate them in order to support nature recovery in different ways. There's biodiversity net gain that I've already talked about, this whole thing about compensating for developer action over there, a massive opportunity, trees and peat, carbon credits, green recovery, water resources, all these things that your land can contribute to, get investment to support and crack on and develop this overall nature recovery network. But this last point about simplicity, what I really want to clarify is that we do have this opportunity to engage with local NRN, Nature Recovery Network contacts within Natural England and broader with Wildlife Trust, etc. And so there's the opportunity to engage with those individuals and think a bit more simplistically about what could happen in your place, what is most appropriate to your estate and to your clients. And I think that's where we can start, brigading things appropriately and most simply. Thank you.
James, thank you very much for a quick but very comprehensive canter through what Nature Recovery Network might look like in practice. So we're going to move into the Q&A session, and if I can invite all speakers to go on camera now. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a couple of questions for Julian on local nature recovery strategies. And the first question is a general one, really. So when will those strategies be brought in, and how long will the engagement process be before they are brought in, and will there be any further pilots? That's the first question.
Good questions. And in response, my answer will consider, I guess, a number of things that have to happen before we can start getting on with preparing the strategies. The first thing that we need to pass is Royal Assent of the Environment Bill. So that's local nature recovery strategies are still not required in legislation. So the Environment Bill has to pass into Royal Assent. And then after that, we will need to think about preparing something called regulations, so secondary legislation, and some guidance. And this is guidance to the local areas on how they should approach preparing the local nature recovery strategy. So it's exactly what we're consulting on at the minute. Once we have all that in place, we hope to begin preparation of local nature recovery strategies. This won't be before April 2022 next year. There's quite a bit to get done. I suspect it might be slightly after. So I can't give you a precise timing, but it won't be before then. I'm fairly confident about that because we've got a lot to put in place. In terms of further pilots, we're not planning any at the minute. We've done our 5, the lessons learned are published, and I hope they're useful. I hope they give people a flavour for the sort of thing that we tested in practice and the sorts of lessons that we will take on board when moving to national rollout. And one sort of question in there about how long preparation of LNRSs will be. I think that's going to vary by area. There's something that we're looking at in the consultation. Based on our experience in the pilots, around 12 to 18 months, we think, is probably the sort of timescale we're looking at start to finish. But I suspect that there will be variations. Some might go quicker because they already have the basics in place, the partnerships, the contacts with stakeholders, the data. Others, it might take longer because they're starting from a kind of lower base. They've got to put some of the foundations in place. But that's our assumption at the minute, based on the experience we had with the pilots.
Thank you. Second question on LNRS before we move on to Nature Recovery Network. And that's a question from Michael Carroll. How will regional level development concepts such as the Oxcam ARC be encouraged to get involved in LNRS?
Good question. And if it's any reassurance, the Oxcam team in DEFRA is part of my wider team. So we do talk to that team quite a bit, as well as the other bits of the DEFRA group who are working on Oxcam. And of course, MHCLG, or their new name, DLUC, I think is the acronym, the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, if I've got that right. So yeah, we are talking to them about these exact things. I suspect, and we have to go through the process of appointing the responsible authorities to lead the LNRSs, but I suspect we will have LNRSs that are roughly county size, possibly being led by county councils, combined authorities. The Oxcam ARC is a biggie. That's a big geographical area covering 5 or so counties, if I've got my geography correct. So the ARC would almost sit above multiple local nature recovery strategies and hopefully would help join up across the strategies, the individual strategies, looking at perhaps ARC-wide things that might be included in the LNRSs themselves. So I think the bigger development corporations or areas like that could help with LNRS join up. but it's unlikely that they would be the actual local leads themselves, because of what we've set out in legislation in the bill about who is eligible to be the responsible authority.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Could I just add something to that last answer, please? My old area team in Natural England obviously has been heavily involved in the Oxfam work from a local delivery point of view, as have the other arm's length bodies, Forestry Commission and EA. So that work will continue in terms of how local capacity within the arm's length bodies supports the development of the relevant LNRSs across the ARC. So we're getting it from local and national.
Thank you very much, Aidan. So I'm now going to move to questions on the Nature Recovery Network, and we've got about 20 questions to go through. So if I can ask panelists to keep their answers concise, that will help us take as many questions as possible. And the first one is a general one. So for Nature Recovery Network, how will partnership and collaboration be encouraged, and are there specific plans for engaging with farmers and landowners? I don't know whether, Aidan, you want to start on that?
Yeah, I'll do that. So first of all, there's lots of existing engagement with with farmers and landowners through NE's local delivery work. James mentioned things like CSF. There's a huge amount of work being done for years, so we have lots of local contacts. We also have the National NRN Partnership, which, as I said, has been established since November. So there's a conduit through local teams where we've been building up the capacity for LNRS focused staff and NRN focused staff to sit in those teams and be the point of contact locally. And the allied to that is the National Partnership, where we pick up more strategic issues and talk to organizations either bilaterally as part of that collective partnership, which currently has about 450 organizations in it. So that would cover most bases, I think. So actively encourage partnership is absolutely key to this.
Thank you, Aidan. I think I might stay with you. There's more questions coming before I turn to James. Question from Rachel Gibbs. What is the role of local planning authorities in NRNs, and what should they be doing now in preparation? And Rachel suggests potentially maps might be one of the things they want to prepare. Aidan. Yeah,
very good question. So it links back to some of the points Julian made about the responsible authorities and their role on the local LNRSs, because LNRSs are seen as a big focal point for shaping the ambition and ultimate delivery of the NRN locally. Natural England and the arm's length bodies, again, have long-standing relationships with the local authorities through either being a statutory consultee on specific planning issues or consultants as they develop their local plan. Key here is to obviously link strongly the NRN objectives and the LNRS through to the local planning process, and we'll then build on the relationships we've had. The other thing we've done locally is we've engaged staff to formally sit in that space where they're engaging with local authorities at a proactive level rather than a reactive level. So we're talking about the review of their plans, the coming policy environment, nature recovery networks, LNRS. Those are the basis of a lot of the conversations we're having at the moment, which are not tied into specific planning applications or planning problems. So there's quite a lot on that at the moment.
Thank you very much for that, Aidan. And can I stay with you for one more question?
Yeah, fine.
From Callum? And the question is, given that near development sites are favoured under biodiversity net gain, how will biodiversity net gain help nature recovery networks in that, given the
way net gain has been designed at the moment? You have the ability to do on-site, off-site, and then credits. On-site will form the main part of how we do net gain. So where the development is taking place, if you can deliver the net gain there at the quantum required, that's the best option because you're replacing like for like in situ, as it were. Off-site is where you can't do that on the site because of whatever restrictions. These are all negotiated settlements. And if that fails, you have the opportunity of just buying biodiversity net gain credits, which can be applied under the scheme anywhere. So the net result here is that development will lead to biodiversity net gain. Whether that happens on the site or not is something that will work itself out depending on the actual circumstances of that site. But the actual policy ambition to link the delivery of biodiversity net gain to development is obviously welcomed, but we have the flexibility in the scheme to allow, so it doesn't slow down development or compromise it. You can deliver off-site or you can buy credits if that's what's needed. So there is a range of options there which will allow us to either develop it on-site or do it off-site.
So basically, there is potential, but it is still up in the air at the moment.
It's still being worked out, and actually this year we're testing some of these approaches in 5 areas across England with the local teams using net gain funds and just testing how that process would work out. So we'll learn more from those experiences and can be able to share them in due course.
Thank you very much. We've got questions coming thick and fast. So if I move on, there is a question from Charlie McNichol on the approach being top down and the concerns and the fears that this causes. James, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlie, because I think I might have misrepresented, I fear, the Cambridge example somewhat. So I guess what we've got there is a situation where the local authority has been thinking about nature. They've declared a climate emergency, et cetera, and so forth, and been thinking about how nature could be expanded. And basically, what's happened then is a series of conversations with local landholders and other people who had power over that land to consider what they would be interested in. Like when I mentioned the golf course in the southeast there, other people with the woodlands, etc. and so forth. I'm not going to draw any lines on a map at the moment until those conversations have been had and see what interest there is with this. So that map actually was derived from the local authority and a lot of conversations. And interestingly, one of the places where we are testing whether biodiversity net gain could work with nature recovery is in one of those places, that wedge in the south, again in the southeast of that map, which is in between areas of development in Cambridge. We could actually direct biodiversity net gain to support habitat, stepping stones and all that sort of stuff. But I want to make it very clear, this ain't going to happen if we don't have local buy-in through local nature recovery strategies at the county level, but then the delivery with people. Absolutely, that map is derived from engagement over decades with people around Cambridge.
Excellent.
Yeah. Julian, it's Julian. Just coming in on that, yeah, I absolutely agree with James's point about the kind of layers to this, and to make sure that we do get to the absolute bottom level, and inclusivity and be collaborative in what we identify. That is the principle on which LNRSs have been conceived and developed. On the link with biodiversity net gain, this seems to be coming up quite a bit. Local nature recovery strategies almost have been devised as the targeting framework for biodiversity net gain off-site credits in particular. So it's trying to bring coherence to what might otherwise be rather piecemeal, I guess, approach to offsetting. And the way we would incentivize that, I think there are a few questions in the chat, is in a variety of ways, but in particular through the biodiversity metric. So there will be uplifts in the units that developers have to provide, or reductions if you do it in the right place, to incentivize those gains to happen in areas that have been identified as priority by the local nature recovery strategy. So we're directly trying to tie in the relationship between what potentially multiple developers or those undertaking biodiversity net gain activities do with the kind of priorities and the strategy for the area. That's the idea.
Thank you, Julian, for this extra clarification. I've got a couple of questions about the routes. I guess I'm going to ask them either to Aidan or to James. Is it likely that nature recovery networks will follow the main road or rail routes? And if so, what could that look like? Who would like to take that?
I'll take that one, Judith. So as part of the conversations we're having within the National Nature Recovery Network Partnership, we have rail companies, Highways England, having conversations about the best use of their estate when their estate is long and linear, as we know. And there is the opportunity for them to get into a situation where that can be managed as part of the network. What would it look like? It's the planting regime, it's the management regime, it's all those things in terms of, we have long strips going up and down the country that could be managed for wildlife to kind of move, adapt to climate change, particular species can be planted there. There's a whole range of options we're investigating with them at the moment, but that would again form part of kind of the arteries, if you like, of the network as it develops in and around protected sites in the coming years. James, do you want to add anything on that one?
I think what I'd like to add is the opportunistic nature sometimes of this. Yeah. So if there is a partner, or if there's someone locally, whether that be a public body or a farmer who wants to do good stuff, we want to encourage that. You know, I think that's important. And I think what the local nature recovery strategy provides is some sort of guidance as to the type of habitat that's going to make the most, you know, the biggest bang for our resources, if you see what I mean. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a net zero thing here. So there could be all sorts of opportunities for private investment or different sort of investment regimes to support farmers to do this work. And I did pick up another thing from the chat that, you know, there's something in there about, you know, people worried that perhaps, you know, with changing the farming payment regime and all that sort of stuff might lose touch with some of the work that, you know, perhaps some of the smaller holdings are doing on their special sites. And that is not the plan, is my understanding, for the environmental land management schemes. There's still that recognition as to what people are doing and how important that is, and to not lose these core sites. That is the fundamental basis to the nature recovery network, is to recognize the good stuff that people are already doing. It's really important that people understand.
Just add as an example, just add as a quick example of that, we're also having conversations with companies who, for example, manage the estate of some of the large supermarkets, and rather than it being, you know, not managed particularly well for biodiversity, we can start to influence that through their management regimes as well. So it's, you know, everybody, there's an opportunity for so many businesses to get involved in this.
Thank you both. And Melissa and Georgina, who'd asked questions about roots, I hope that starts to answer them, although it sounds like what you might have been after, which is certainty about which routes are going to be taken, might not yet be available at this point. Moving on to a question from John Cresswell and also Mark Bridgman. There has been work on local maps as part of pilot projects, but there appear to be some data not spots, for want of a better word, and some inaccuracies. So how will that be dealt with to make both local nature recovery strategies and nature recovery network work well from the start? And in particular, landowners are probably the best people to know what is on their land. How are you going to bring that knowledge in? Who would like to take that? James?
Well, I can start, and perhaps maybe Julian can follow up, because I guess that the big thing here is the development of the local nature recovery strategies, aren't they? You know, and we're going to provide some national data for those local nature recovery strategies. But these local nature recovery strategies are developed with people, with the local authorities, with other people, and that provides an opportunity for data sharing in all sorts of ways. I might quickly flick past straight to Julian, actually, to make sure I've got that right. But yeah, that's my understanding.
Julian.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think the answer is in multiple ways. And this is something that we're looking at as part of the design of the whole local nature recovery strategy system, if you like, although I need to stop calling it that. So yes, there will be an opportunity, I think, in multiple points for engagement by all stakeholders in the preparation process. So that is the first thing. You know, if you have stuff to offer from a nature recovery perspective, there will be the opportunity to do so. And we want to make that as easy as possible for you. Hence my point earlier about us testing this idea of a local convener. I hope we don't go with that term, but it's basically people looking to facilitate specifically the land-based sector's engagement in LNRSs in recognition of how important it is. We also ask questions in our consultation about consulting on local nature recovery strategies. Should there, for example, be an opportunity for a landowner or land manager to have their land removed from the LNRS if they don't want it to be part of an area that has been identified? Equally, should there be, as part of the consultation, opportunities for inclusion of other areas that haven't been identified in the LNRS for whatever reason at that stage? So we're trying to build in lots of checks and balances to make sure that your expertise, your knowledge of your areas gets fed in and recognised. And if you have data that is relevant and applicable, particularly in the LNRS area, then please do feed that in, and we're looking at how that can be incorporated. So lots of different ways, and I hope that is reassuring.
We've got about 5 minutes left and about 10 questions, so let's try and power on through them. Question from Kate Russell, which I guess would be of interest to everybody. Will government commit to giving proper resources for the delivery of local nature recovery strategies that are, accurate for those strategies to be accurate and timely with full engagement? So it's about resourcing, which I know if you're looking particularly at the roles of local planning authorities, which are already pretty stretched, it would be a concern to most people on the webinar. And I think that's one for Julian.
Yeah, I thought that might come to me. Yes, that is one of the take-home messages from our pilots too, the importance of having the right resource in the right place, supported by the right expertise. It was writ large as part of our lesson learned from the pilots. We recognise the need to adequately resource the preparation of LNRSs, and that's the preparation. Come on to delivery, we're into conversations about environmental land management, biodiversity net gain, all sorts of other funding sources. But yeah, we recognise the need to resource it. I can't give you any commitments as to how exactly we will do that. Spending reviews are ongoing at the minute, but hopefully we will have more clarity on what resource will be available as we approach April 2022.
Thank you. Moving on to a question on access, which was raised by a number of people, including Catherine Gray. How can public access be managed safely for public, farmers and for nature, given some of the issues that we've seen this summer and indeed last summer with people not respecting signs, etc., etc.? And will this be considered in LNRSs and Nature Recovery Network? Who wants to start on that?
I'll make a start, Judy, if that's okay. So there's two sides to this story from last summer when we opened up after the first lockdowns, and people who'd been crammed in their houses wanted to get out into the outdoors. Point I made in my presentation, we've now understand as a society the importance and the value of the outdoors for people's mental health and well-being like never before. The downside, and I was still an area manager at the time, is that there's quite a lot of people who are uneducated in terms of the countryside code and don't fully understand how they should behave when they're out on other people's land. All that work is continuing to be reinforced in terms of, the countryside code, those messages, our access team, etc., etc. That still remains an ongoing piece of work within NE, which has been for a long, long time to reinforce those messages. I think there's a point here to kind of pick out a little bit where, when I described the objectives of the NRN, they range from biodiversity, system health, climate change adaptation, and we included in there, for obvious reasons, access and engagement. It doesn't necessarily mean that all parts of the network will be open access. We're not suggesting that. In fact, a lot of the access work we will do as Natural England, as an arm's length body, will be picked up by our Connecting People with Nature team. All our research into this issue suggests that, I have to say, last summer was unusual, because there was that spike post-lockdown, but our research through MINI, it's called, Monitoring Engagement with the Natural Environment, suggests that people travel no more than 2 kilometres to engage with green space. So there's going to be a huge amount of work in terms of, as James mentioned, the green infrastructure in our towns and cities to prepare those areas where populations exist to access those areas, whether they're country parks or green infrastructure where they live and normally occupy that space. There isn't a suggestion in the LNRS or the NRN there's going to be vast increases in the access, but it is going to be an important element of it. So I think people can rely on the ongoing work in terms of access, conduct, countryside code and all the rest to pick up those issues. And the Nature Recovery Network elements, as I said in my presentation, will range from those green infrastructure, urban, peri-urban, all the way through to the wildest part of this country. And we will manage kind of it at an appropriate level where you can imagine a country park would have dramatic footfall compared to something that's in the uplands and very remote. I don't think there's going to be a dramatic increase in engagement there. But when we say engagement, it's engagement that will fit in with the conditions and circumstances of land and land ownership. James, do you want to add anything on that? Is that okay?
I'm going to leave it there for now, because we're now over time, and I've got two questions that I really want to ask. We have got a lot of questions on the chat about the risk to biodiversity of actually linking areas together, which I won't bring here, but I certainly will leave that with you, because that's an interesting one. The two questions that I would like to ask, the first one is on permanency. I think it's a question from Frank Lucas. Will land committed to nature recovery need to be committed in perpetuity or for an agreed timescale? And if the latter, what happens at the end of the agreement? So that's the first question. Who wants to take that? James.
I think we all want to go, but we'll leave James go first.
I think I'll give it to James, given timing.
Well, I think it depends on the deal you've made. You know, the specific deal in terms of, you know, whether you've gone for biodiversity net gain. The suggestion is it's about 30 years. Where you've done an agri-environment agreement, it'll be short or whatever. So that's the specific legal requirement. But I guess when we are talking about nature recovery, then yeah, it takes a long time for habitats to develop. It takes a long time for those connectivities, those connections in the landscape to bear fruit in terms of wildlife. So we want these things to last as long as possible, which is why we want the deal to be as favorable as possible. But yeah, there'll be specific requirements depending on the deal you've made.
Thank you. And the final question is about how existing groups can get involved. So we've had several questions on that. Farm clusters is one of the groups that is mentioned, but also catchment groups and local nature partnership. How do you see that evolving? How do we build on what's already there and functioning? Who wants to take that?
I'll start on that, if that's okay. Just quick message. We're not doing everything new. We're building on the foundations, I think, as James said in his presentation, of what's gone on over the last 30 or 40 years. That includes the initiatives and efforts that people have put in terms of their land management. It also deals with the governance and groups that have arisen around the country to try and do some of this stuff. We will be incorporating and building on those relationships. All those people and groups will obviously be invited to the LNRS process as it rolls out, but actually there'll be new and additional groups in there as well. But we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. We want to build on all the good stuff that's gone before and work together to improve it.
Definitely, yeah. And just to say, I mean, local nature partnerships are another one of my policy areas. We see the partnerships evolving and almost certainly supporting the preparation and subsequent implementation of LNRSs. It's going to be about bringing all the partnerships together, hopefully around the local nature recovery strategies, that I think is going to be the key to success. I think that's certainly what we're exploring and talking about.
Thank you. That's incredibly useful to get us started, to get us started in terms of thinking of how these groups might be involved. So we're coming to the end of this webinar, so I would like to thank all our panelists for joining us this morning. James, Aidan and Julian, much appreciated. Before we close the sessions, just a few observations from me. I think it's incredibly useful to hear the recognition that there is a need for resourcing, there is a critical need for engagement, and in particular, engagement of local communities and local landowners. We will hold you to this. And you've heard the messages, I'm sure, about tying in biodiversity net gain, LNRSs, and also nature recovery strategy. And it's very helpful to know that you're thinking about it too, because it's quite obvious from the volume of questions on that today that it is an issue for our members too. And there are many elements to balance. And again, we've only had time to scratch the surface in this webinar. Nature, people's access to nature, and also housing, which we haven't even touched about. It was really useful to see the jigsaw puzzle slide that James put up about what local opportunities look like. There was a question in the chat which we didn't have time to get to about who decides what the jigsaw looks like in overview, and then how can you make sure that all falls into play. I think one of the things that the CLA would be keen to raise during the consultation response and engage with you further on is what help can our members expect to help them make sense of the jigsaw and how they fit into it and how they can make it gel for them. So that's probably another webinar of its own. But a really important question because, as I think James recognized in his presentation, it looks very complex. There's a lot of elements to juggle with. And so the ideas of conveners, or whatever they turn out to be called, sounds like a really important one. So as I mentioned before, the CLA will be responding to the consultation. I think that my colleague Susan put the relevant contact details in the chat. So for participants, please do get in touch with us if you're interested. And I would like to thank Natural England, our partner for today. And finally, to bring panelists and participants' attention to our Rural Business Conference, which is being held in London on the 2nd of December, and for which a few tickets are still available. And the contact for that is in the slide. So thank you very much. I hope that you've enjoyed today's session, and goodbye for now.